myself to welcome you all here today to Parliament Buildings for this meeting of the Special British-Irish Parliamentary Assembly. And I want to thank your co-chairpersons, Brendan Smith and Karen Bradley, for the opportunity to speak to you today. And it is very good to see so many familiar faces around the chamber this morning. I'm delighted to be able to host this session this morning in the chamber for two reasons, actually. First of all, it is very fitting that you are here during the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement period. And secondly, I do strongly believe that inter-parliamentary relations are indeed extremely important. You should know that we are counting your session today as the first of the programme of events and initiatives to mark this milestone here in Parliament Buildings. Now, we cannot deny that there have been delays and disappointments over the years which have replaced much of the hope and optimism in 1998, with public some cynicism and frustration indeed. However, we are sometimes in danger of forgetting how far we have come, how hard-won the agreement was, and how challenging achieving agreement is indeed in a divided society. Not only is it the 25th anniversary of the agreement, it is also the 25th anniversary of the establishment of this particular Assembly. And that is particularly important for us to remember, because the Assembly is essentially and should be the heartbeat of our politics. As a centrepiece of the agreement, we also have to acknowledge that when the Assembly is not operating, it has a dead-hand impact on the other key institutions and indeed on our body politic as a whole. All parliamentary institutions evolve, and while we have debate about reform at this time, in my view, I think we have to recognise that the institutions have not been working totally for 25 years, and therefore we have lost valuable time in which we would have evolved in the natural course of events. Now, this anniversary year is an opportunity for us collectively to reflect and to focus on building for the future. My reflection would be that over the 25 years we have understandably had much focus on the executive, but arguably to the detriment of the Assembly itself. Over the past 3 years, officials and I have frequently discussed issues in the context of enabling a parliamentary culture, and I think that the development of the Assembly itself is the key issue for the future discussion. Inter-parliamentary relations are another issue which I view as being vital to the future development of the Assembly. The Good Friday Agreement saw a transformation of relationships across and between our respective legislators, and that has been very, very important, and an important means of continuing that process. As Speaker, I have also had the privilege of welcoming many international diplomats and guests and parliamentary delegations, and that has only served to underline continually to me how much goodwill and support that there is available to us, particularly if we have political stability established. While the Executive and the Ministers have the key role in building our external relationships, the Assembly also has an opportunity to build on these relationships and opportunities. Connections with other parliaments can be an essential element of doing that both formally and informally. About 10 days ago, I had the pleasure of hosting discussions between the Speakers and Presiding Officers and the Ceann Comhairle from Westminster, the Oireachtas, Edinburgh and Cardiff. BIPA has also shown itself to be a most valuable platform for continuing the dialogue across these islands. So I would certainly be encouraging that the Assembly take up a more strategic approach to parliamentary relations in the time ahead. I would just hope that we get to that point sooner rather than later. The anniversary this year is an opportunity for us to all collectively reflect and focus on building for the future. So thank you all again, Karen and Brendan, and I know that you have a busy programme of sessions ahead today. So I look forward to hosting the lunch for you all today and continuing our conversation. So all I would finally say is good luck, Bertie, at this particular point in time of your deliberations, and thank you all very much.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Assembly, I would like to thank you for addressing us here today, for your warm welcome to Belfast and for generously allowing the Assembly to meet in these splendid surroundings. It is an honour to be here and to support your aims to instil a parliamentary culture here in Stormont, which BIPA can, I know, be a key part of. So thank you.
We now resume our usual order of business. Could I ask members, when they are invited to contribute from the floor, they will clearly state their name and legislature. If possible, members are encouraged to stand when speaking, as this will support the broadcast of the Assembly, which is live via the Northern Ireland Assembly website. If members prefer, they may of course remain seated when speaking. Noting the proceedings are public and being live streamed on the Northern Ireland Assembly's website, may I remind members that the proceedings of this body do not attract parliamentary privilege. Members, I would like to repeat the Speaker's welcome to Belfast and echo my co-chair's Karen's thanks to him for his welcome and for allowing us the use of this fine chamber for our proceedings today. We are delighted to be holding the 63rd extraordinary plenary session of the British Irish Parliamentary Assembly in Belfast, as we mark the 25th anniversary of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. We will be hearing today from some of those who were directly involved in the peace negotiations leading to the signing of the agreement. We will have the opportunity to hear about the significance of the agreement, reflect on its achievements, recognise the areas that still need implementation, and we look to the future. You have all been circulated with an up-to-date list of BIPA membership in your briefing packs. I have to inform the Assembly also that in accordance with Rule 2A, the following associate members have accepted the invitation of the Steering Committee to assume the powers and responsibilities of members for the whole of this session. Jackie Dial-Price MP, Baroness Hooper, Lord Kilclooney, Baroness Ritchie of Downpatrick, Rose Conway-Walsh TD, Kevin Campbell, Member of the Senate, Cathal Boylan MLA and Deputy Chris Blinn. Apologies. We have received apologies for the plenary session from Alistair Carmichael MP, Lord Donoghue, Lord Dubs, Damien Green MP, Stephen Hammond MP, Sarah Jones MP, Conor McGinn MP, Nigel Mills MP, Sir Clark TD, Patrick Costello TD, Sean Crowe TD, Peter Fitzpatrick TD, John Paul Phelan TD, Senator Vincent P. Martin, Helen Fiken, Member of the Senate, Pat Sheehan MLA and Deputy Alan Brewer.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to welcome members here today for our 63rd plenary session of the British Irish Parliamentary Assembly. Members will have received a copy of the programme of business. It is highly appropriate that our Assembly should meet here to mark the 25th anniversary of the signing of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. We look forward to stimulating discussions and debates. We will shortly hear from the former Taoiseach, Mr Bertie Ahern, and Sir John Holmes, Principal Private Secretary to both Tony Blair and Sir John Major during their premierships. Both will address the Assembly and then respond to questions. After a short coffee break, the morning session will conclude with a panel discussion on the Women's Coalition and the Good Friday Agreement. The panel comprises of founding members of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition. There will then be an opportunity for questions. The afternoon session will begin with an address from Dr Johnny Byrne, Ulster University, on policing under the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and following which we will hold a debate by members on policing under the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. Our proceedings today will conclude with a debate on a motion on the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and the Assembly will adjourn not later than 4:45 p.m. Given we have a full agenda today, can I ask that all members keep their questions and contributions short during the course of the day? I will now ask Steve Aitken, MLA, to formally move that the adoption of the proposed programme of business be agreed to.
Indeed, co-chairs. On behalf of all the MLAs in this Assembly, I would like to say, first of all, thank you very much indeed for coming here. And secondly, we are the ones who should be in here, all of us MLAs, doing our own job today, not you being in here. But I welcome you no matter what. But thank you all for very much in coming indeed. And may I formally propose the agenda. Thank you.
Is that agreed?
I now call on former Taoiseach Bertie Ahern to give his address. Bertie Ahern, you are very welcome. We are absolutely delighted that you are here with us today. We are very conscious of your ongoing commitment to peace building and conflict resolution, both at home and around the world. So, Bertie, when they're ready.
Thank you very much, co-chairs, and thank you very much for the invitation, the Speaker, to use this beautiful assembly as well. My previous visits here were usually from up there, watching down on the activities. I look forward to that day again, hopefully not too long, so we'll have the opportunity again to be here. Just to, I want to hit just on 2 or 3 points, and I understand there might be some questions. If there is, I'm glad to try and answer those. But first of all, I remember back when the 1990, when the British-Irish Parliamentary Assembly, or then what it was the inter-parliamentary body, was set up. It was after a particularly difficult period in the late 80s, when perhaps our relations weren't as good as they could be, and the idea was to try and get parliamentarians together from London and from Dublin, and I think it proved to be a very good body. I had the opportunity a number of times over the years of meeting the Assembly in its original format, and then in its in this format. So I'm honoured to be here again, and wish you well for your deliberations and for your meetings. I have found it over the years to be very useful, and it was a very useful and successful way of us getting to know members from the Lords and the Commons, and that was, I think, its primary aim, where we were able to build up good relationships and understand each other better than what was maybe the 1980s megaphone arguments that went on between us. So I wish you well in all your work. I suppose the history, I'm delighted to be with John Holmes. John Holmes and I battled together well over the years. He was with John Major first, and then with Tony Blair, and appreciated always the long meetings. I'm not sure he and his colleagues appreciated the length of the meetings that used to go on, and particularly in the Rose Garden and elsewhere, and when we were in number 10. But I certainly appreciated his work and his guidance and his help over those years. And we haven't met for many years, so delighted to meet him. I suppose I just want to touch very briefly on the history. This occasion is to mark the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, and I suppose it is extraordinary when we did negotiate that, and all the people that were involved in it. And I want to particularly mention all the people from all the parties, but particularly mention those that are no longer with us. People like John Hume and Seamus Mallon and Mark McGuinness and Davy Irvine and Mo Molan and others who were such a part of that agreement. And from my part, and it's everybody's part, they're always missed. Their role in it and the part they played was enormous. When I took up the involvement, I'd been involved in the early 90s when John Wilson had been chair of the talks, the multi-party talks at that stage, 91, 92. But then later on, when I took up from where Albert Reynolds and Dick Spring had brought us to the Downing Street Declaration, and then on to the work where we were. It was the view that if we could get the all-party talks and the multi-party talks going, which we did in September of 97, that at least we had an opportunity of trying to get discussions. I'd love to bring it through that winter or autumn, winter and spring of 97, 98, but time won't allow to do that, other than to say that it was very interesting, at times entertaining, but mainly difficult periods. And the one thing I learnt in that period of my life was having breaks, even for Christmas, wasn't a good idea, because as soon as you allowed a vacuum, you could be guaranteed that you were in trouble. And we had many problems during that winter, from political violence and paramilitary violence to having to put people out of talks and try and get people back into talks and go on, moving on from time to time. And we went all the way from September to March, and I really felt we seemed to be going backwards every day. I know there are people in this room would remember a lot of those moves back and forward the way they went. But perseverance, and I remember when your members here today, Paul Murphy, will remember when we got to St. Patrick's Day, we seemed to be going nowhere, but George Mitchell decided that he was fed up with it and that we were going to get out of here in a hurry, and that he was going home to his wife and baby, as was then, for St. Patrick's Day, or for Easter. And Tony Blair decided he was going to Spain to meet the Prime Minister, Ahern, and I decided that the league final was in Croke Park, so I was going to go back to see that. So anyway, I hadn't got far to go. But anyway, it did put a focus on the talks of where we would go. And you know, huge commitment, huge effort. My congratulations to all the people who played their part in that. But if you looked at the kind of issues we were trying to deal with, and only to mention them briefly, the core principles to get a devolved administration, to get a north-south bodies, to get east-west institutions, to deal with citizens' rights, to see how we could start the process of an agreement to get police reform, recognition of Northern Ireland as a sovereign part of the UK, along with a democratic path to unite Ireland, a commitment to European-level human rights principles, protections and processes, to see how we would structure a Northern Ireland Assembly elected by proportional representation, an executive appointed to provide guaranteed all-party and community representatives of ministers serving under a joint and deputy joint minister of cross-border bodies operating north and south in trade and business, to set up structures for EU funding, food safety, inland waterways, locks management, language promotion, international tourism, a British-Irish Council that was representative of the administrations of these islands, a British-Irish Intergovernmental Council of both sovereign governments, a decommissioning body to oversee and report on destruction of paramilitary weapons, a new police force and police service in Northern Ireland to replace the Royal Ulster Constabulary, and that is mainly the core principles. I'm not going to go through any of them or all of them, but just to give you what the agenda was. And I suppose extraordinarily we did manage to find a way in a relatively short period of time of agreeing at least the structures. Of course, they didn't all happen on the day. Chris Patton took up the mantle of the policing issue. And now it's seen as massively successful all over the world, the work that commission did. Decommissioning was an issue that we struggled with. Probably the one issue, if had it all over again, I would have done differently to how we did it. It dragged out so long that it was painful and divisive. But most of the issues have worked their way with good stability. Of course, I think the peace has worked. The main function of the whole agreement was that I always looked in two sections. One, there was the peace process, that we would bring peace and stability away from, you know, the huge carnage that we'd seen for 25 years. And then we would deal with the political process. I always feel that the first bit, maybe not totally perfect, but fairly close to it. The second bit, up and down, and the fact that these institutions have been struggling for so many times, and probably 60% of the time has not been great, quite frankly. But hopefully that will change in the short term again. Though I must say, and I was talking to the Speaker this morning, it's very impressive what has been achieved when the institutions have been up. Their legislative programme, their private members' bills. Perhaps that's an issue that certainly from Oireachtas Ahern, we don't pass that many private member bills, at least we didn't in my 34 years, that were passed and then enacted into law. They've been very impressive what they have done here in the years that things were working well. So my congratulations to people on that, and hopefully they'll be able to get to that situation again. So we're not going. You understand the ups and downs. I'm not going to do that. I want to touch on two areas that in my time that I think are important. I feel passionate about the north-south and the east-west relationships, and particularly because you're all here today, and the east-west thing is the east-west institutions are very important. It worries me at times when I hear people saying, because the United Kingdom is no longer in the European Union, and our officials are not meeting as they used to meet, which is true. Every day there were working groups and there were various groups, and people talk, including in the Oireachtas and in Westminster, that we need new institutions. I want to touch on this issue because we don't need any new institutions, in my view. All we need to do is to work the institutions that were agreed on Good Friday. So if I can just make a few points on this, because I think it's relevant and my one chance of being able to make this body. I think the different perspectives that we all had to deal with into making and agreeing and then to delivering the Good Friday Agreement. As we know, the island was divided in 1922 to propose certainty to different tribes and different cultures and different beliefs, and partition didn't create those divisions, but it certainly did embed them. And out of that came a society where different communities and in different ways each felt besieged and embattled by the other. And the story of the Troubles, which I always say hardly explains the horror it conveys, was the backdrop. All my political life as a young adult and young politician in the 70s was and remains the biggest thing that we have to deal with. But I think the new perspective and the profound change that the Good Friday Agreement brought about was the breaking through of unseemingly unbreakable barriers embedded since partition. And there could be parity esteem, which was the big issue of 25 years ago for different traditions. And the sovereign governments on these islands and the political parties in Northern Ireland and the international community, and above all the people on the island, voted in that referendum of 25 years ago. And they democratically endorsed a profoundly changed future that would be utterly different from the past that preceded it. And that future, of course, has moved on. We've had 25 years of fairly perfect peace compared with the 25 years that we'd seen before that. And the difference between those two periods is of course, very much light and dark. And in the grind of politics, there is understandably frustration that what was hoped for has only been realised partially or occasionally. And I understand that frustration, but I also have a sense of perspective that 25 years is a golden era compared to what was and could have been, and more importantly, convinced that what is to come is and is very possible is better yet. So in the context of Irish history, even in the last 100 years since partition, 25 years is a short time. And we must be patient, we must persevere. And I think as we celebrate this year and celebrate the pluses and the minuses of what has gone over the period since the Good Friday Agreement was voted on by the people. And of course we have to look at what happened in between. The fact of Brexit, unimaginable in 1998. We discussed everything in 1998 from A to Z and back and up and down, but nobody ever mentioned that the United Kingdom could possibly leave the European Union. If they did, people would have probably thought they were funny people anyway, but nobody did mention it. But the work of this week, I think, is to, and the work of this day last week was to bring the United Kingdom to the end of that period of what the arguments we've had since 2016. And I think the context then for Northern Ireland is is different. In the UK, outside the European Union, but determined of good working relations with it, the East-West relationship between the United Kingdom and Ireland has changed, and there's intense focus on getting the institutions back up and running in this Assembly, and that's rightly so. But the future I foresee, and the one provided from the Good Friday Agreement 25 years ago, is one with much deeper and more dynamic relations and between the sovereign governments East and West. Ironically, the change contest provides a dynamic for all of this to happen, and there is an essential Irish interest in replacing the rich ecosystem of informal British-Irish relationships we mutually enjoyed on the margins of our shared EU business in Brussels. The British-Irish Council has to be reinvigorated, and I especially welcome the attendance of Prime Minister Sunak at its recent proceedings, the first Prime Minister to do so since Gordon Brown over a decade ago. And of course, the United Kingdom itself has changed and made important decisions for itself about devolution. And there's a shared community of interest across these islands. And in the context of a more diverse constitutional arrangement in the UK, a shared forum between the sovereign governments and the devolved administrations make perfect sense. So I think it's time for us now to get and use the institutions as we set out in the agreement, and particularly on the East-West. The British-Irish relationship remains one of deep mutual interest, and it's far wider than Northern Ireland. If it proves to be, and I hope it is, that the United Kingdom has reached the end of the beginning of its departure from the EU post-Brexit, it will understandably want to capitalise by normalising its relations with Brussels. And in that context, Ireland will be important to the UK in rebuilding relationships with the European Union, and we can be a good neighbour and a friend to the UK. And that was the purpose of the whole purpose of the East-West institutions that we established under the Good Friday Agreement. And in a context now that nobody envisaged then, their utility importance would seem to be far greater than ever. And I would urge people to take an interest in developing that area, which was not treated very seriously. And I won't go into blaming anybody, but just say it was not treated seriously over the last 2 decades. We have a shared interest in many areas. I mentioned last week about the North Seas energy cooperation, but there are so many other areas where energy interconnectors and so many other areas we can deal with these issues. So I do believe the work that you participate in here in building up the East-West will have an enormous and important part to play. Can I just mention briefly 2 other points, if I can. The International Reporting Process Commission of Engagement, which is the IRC report. I've been reading that recently, and it highlights many important issues. In one area I'd just like to stress to all of the honourable members of this Assembly is that work around the engagement with paramilitaries. It is a fact of life in this divided society that there is unfinished work to do with dealing with paramilitaries. We've seen an event recently in Oma, but the far wider process I want to just address for a second. It is a fact of life. The paramilitarism and the structure for the paramilitarism are still there. And the IRC report, if you get a chance, if those who may not have looked at it, they make very interesting points about that there should be a process of continuing the dialogue with these groups and to try to bring it to a particular road where we will see the end of them. They're very good. Mitchell Rees, who's the American representative, John Bertie and Tim O'Connor, Monica McWilliams, who give their time in that group, have outlined in very clear terms of the necessity for the resources and the effort and the commitment of politicians, the commitments of the governments to deal with this issue. Unfortunately, it has drifted on. 25 years ago, we thought this would be a matter that had not concluded. I'm not here to denounce any of the efforts or the work or the engagement of what goes on in paramilitaries. That's not the point I'm making. I'm making the point that in a normal society we have to work to where they're no longer there, where they're no longer part of society, where they're no longer part of what happens. And it is a fact, as they point out in their engagement, and that the paramilitary structures are still there. Some paramilitaries have moved away and are gone, and that's end of story. People have moved on with their lives or into politics, but there are structures and engagements where that hasn't happened in quite a sophisticated way. They set it out in their research, and I think it is an area. So rather than, I'm not into business condemning it, I'm into the business of asking people to help and to work and resource so that these issues can be dealt with, whether it's community policing, whether it's new structures of neighbourhoods. But it is an area that has been left for quite a considerable time. And the 4 or 5 pages of the report, if you read that, you read the report of the IRC, I think it's 20 to 25, you will see what they're suggesting. And they've made recommendations to the government, and it's been discussed recently at the Intergovernmental Conference. So it is a very important issue. My last point, it would be wrong not to say something about the present position. I keep a close interest in everything from the backstop to the protocol to where we are now with the Windsor framework, and needless to say, I wish that well. I have argued long over the winter in many programmes that there were issues to be addressed, and that it was a fair argument for unionism to make the case that the UK internal economy was something that they should be able to deal with without the European Union oversight into it. I've also made the arguments last year, or earlier last year, about the issues to do with medicines and about some of the state aid rules and the VAT rules. But as I read it and understand it, and I think everyone has had a chance, it was a mouthful of documents, but when you analyse what's in the documents, which I've had a chance of reading fully, if you look at the 5 or 6 issues that we spoke about for the last few years, on goods moving from GB to Northern Ireland, a customs-based approach based on whether goods are staying in Northern Ireland or moving into the single market. The former will benefit from an expanded trusted trader scheme, which dramatically simplified procedures and drastically simplified declarations with reduced data requirements. On the SPS, on the agri-food retail products for end consumption, Northern Ireland will be able to move with minimal certification requirements and controls. Physical checks will follow a risk-based approach. There's additional safeguards, including labelling. There's special arrangements applied for movements of pets, plants and seed potatoes, which is an issue kept coming up in debates. There's substantial facilitation for moving parcels, both business to customer, business to business, customer to business, with the last being entirely exempt from customs procedures. There's a permanent solution on medicines, ensuring Northern Ireland's access to all medicines, including novel medicines at the same time to GB. New flexibilities on VAT, including the ability to seek UK VAT rates below minimum for removal goods with no risks. Resolution of issues associated with the tariff rate quotas for steel, and clarification of application of state rules. There are other safeguards as well. I think these have been the main points that we have been across. My congratulations to the negotiators, and congratulations to Markus Sukovic and to Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. It seems to me, on any fair examination, that the main points have been dealt with. Of course, there are always people and people rightly look at these things and want to see that there are clarifications and people understand it. But hopefully, in the short term, and nobody wants to put dates on these things, but in the short term, these issues can be wrapped up. We've had a long debate now for several years, really since Theresa May made the Lancaster House speech in January 2017, when she stated that not alone was the UK pulling out of the single market, was pulling out of the customs union, which was a surprise at that day. We've dealt with those issues. But 6 years later, on my reading of the issues, and when I can say personally, the issues that I was making, as I thought were fair points on behalf of unionism, that those issues have been comprehensively dealt with, and hopefully we can successfully move on and move on to a position where we can see the institutions of the Good Friday set up. Whether that happens in a week or a month is really irrelevant, but the sooner the better, where politicians will again be able to move. So I want to wish everybody well in those discussions, and hopefully we can bring it to finality. My last point is to say to you, good politicians, my admiration as always to my previous profession, to all of you that work so hard for the people. Politics never gets any easier. It seems to be more difficult, sometimes even more trivial. I don't know how you deal with some of the issues you have to deal with. I think if we had had social media back when we were negotiating the Good Friday Agreement, I think John Taylor would probably agree with me. It would have been a bit difficult, John, to do that. It was hard enough to keep everyone locked up in castle buildings, but we managed, I think, to deal with issues. But you have to deal with a more difficult world. I know that the press is pro-politicians, as they always were, but I wish you well in all the tasks that you have to deal with. And I do salute you for your determination to make things better, to make society better, which is what politics is about. I congratulate all the parties you represent for the effort they put into politics, trying to make life better. And I do acknowledge all of you in whatever way you helped to negotiate to see the Good Friday Agreement through. That is something that we can all be eternally happy with. It was the work of many hands. I was honoured to be Taoiseach at the time, worked with Tony Blair, and worked with so many other politicians. But the one thing I found was across all the parties that there was a tremendous commitment to making peace on this island, and to work with Secretary of State Paul Murphy, and to see the progress that was made. And all I'd ask you is to keep on working to make sure it is a process. It's never over. What we do is we celebrate the 25-year since we negotiated, but I'd ask you to maintain the same vigilance that's necessary, because there won't be a day where you can say it's complete. The work continues. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bertie, for your very comprehensive outline of the negotiations leading up to the agreement in April 1998, and also to the working of the Good Friday Agreement in the meantime. One phrase that you used among the many phrases that struck me was, "What was hoped for has only been partially realised." I think the theme of our plenary session is very much building on the success of what has been achieved and looking to the next period ahead as well. So it's very much in sync with your own thoughts here today and your encouragement, because the Ireland that we have today is transformed what it was pre the Good Friday Agreement. And as you said, Bertie, to you and all the others who made that possible, as a society and as islands, we are eternally grateful for that good work. We will take questions from the floor after the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Brendan. And I'm delighted to welcome Sir John Holmes here today. Sir John was Principal Private Secretary to both Sir John Major and Sir Tony Blair during their premierships, and was knighted in the 1999 New Year Honours for services to peace in Northern Ireland. He has since had a distinguished career of public service as an ambassador to Portugal and then to France, as Emergency Relief Coordinator for the United Nations and as Chair of the United Kingdom's Electoral Commission. Sir John, could I now call on you to give your address?
Well, thank you very much indeed for the opportunity to speak to you today about the significance of the Good Friday Agreement. It's a bit hard for me to follow Bertie Ahern, to be honest. Clearly, I should be Tony Blair, but obviously, for better or for worse, I'm not, so you'll have to make do with me. It's also a bit difficult to say anything new or original about an iconic event such as the Good Friday Agreement. I mean, so many millions of words have been spoken or written about it and will be in the next couple of months. And I'm sure I won't succeed in saying anything original, and I apologise for that. I also apologise for speaking very much from the perspective of Downing Street over these events and paying correspondingly less attention to the roles of the many other people who made peace possible from elsewhere. Bertie has already mentioned many of them, especially those no longer with us. And I salute them all fully, even if I don't mention, in what I'm going to say, mention them explicitly. So why am I here? I mean, I'm not a Northern Ireland expert, but I was closely involved in the run-up to the Good Friday Agreement and its immediate aftermath, after I became John Major's overseas advisor in January 1996, I should say. I'm not that old. I mean, my role covered everything in Downing Street related to foreign policy, defence and overseas aid, but also, and rather oddly in some ways you might think, Northern Ireland. I think the main logic was that historically much of the activity of the post had been about relations with the Irish Republic and the US. But in any case, I quickly discovered that Northern Irish affairs, and particularly the peace process, occupied a very substantial portion of my time, probably sometimes up to half of it, even though I had no shortage of other things to do. And my part in all this under Blair, as well as Major, was multiple, if you like. In addition to being an advisor, I was the main link between the Northern Ireland office and Downing Street, the high-level interlocutor with the US government, who were very interested, obviously, the chief contact with the Taoiseach's office in Dublin, and last but not least, an interlocutor on behalf of the Prime Minister with the main Northern Ireland parties when they didn't want to go through the Northern Ireland office. And this last role was particularly important for the Unionists, who had long suspected the Northern Ireland office of being too close to Dublin, too green, and simply not to be trusted. And they therefore especially valued the link that I and others were able to provide with Downing Street. Obviously, they always wanted to talk to the Prime Minister himself if they could, but in the absence of that, they wanted to talk to me or later with Jonathan Powell, Tony Blair's Chief of Staff. Now, my own time in Number 10 started rather inauspiciously. In February 1996, as you'll remember, the Provisional IRA broke the ceasefire which had been in place since 1994 by setting off a bomb in the City of London, against the background of all the long-running and difficult arguments about the decommissioning of weapons and the failure to start all-party talks. But to his great credit, and I think, and in line with the huge personal effort he'd already put in to make peace possible, John Major did not take what might have been the easy way out by, in effect, abandoning peace efforts until after the next election, which he could have done, especially considering his own slim majority at the time and troubles with members of his own party. Instead, he restarted the painstaking process of trying to build a way forward again, trying to rebuild the trusts which had been lost during the ceasefire and its abrupt ending. And I think that despite unpromising circumstances, false steps, setbacks during those next few months, some progress was still made. For example, we had the start, after the controversial election of a constituent body, of multi-party talks, despite the absence from them at that point of Sinn Féin. But still, by late 1966, I'll get this right in a minute, 1996, it was clear that substantive progress would have to await the arrival of a new government after the UK elections in May 1997, and attention on all sides switched to preparing for that. And somewhat unusually, I was asked to stay in my role in Downing Street by Tony Blair, the incoming Prime Minister, because I was able to provide some continuity. He arrived determined to take full advantage of his large majority in the area of Northern Ireland as elsewhere, and to move things on as quickly as possible in a way that John Major had ultimately simply not been able to do. Many of you may recall his speech in Belfast shortly after he became Prime Minister. He reassured the Unionists that he was not a persuader for unification and did not expect to see any such thing in his lifetime, or that of anyone else in the room. But he also made an offer to Sinn Féin to join in the talks quickly, as long as they renewed their ceasefire and accepted the 6 mutual principles of commitment to peaceful democratic discussion and renunciation of violence. Otherwise, in the words of what became a much overused cliché, the peace train would have to leave without them. To cut a long and difficult and convoluted story short, and most of you know it already, they did renew the ceasefire in July 1997 and said enough about the mutual principles to join the talks in September, indecently quickly, I have to say, some thought at the time. So the stage was set for the intensification of the talks with a deadline of May 1998, which ultimately led to the Good Friday Agreement some 7 months later. As Bertie Ahern has said, that period was not exactly a smooth process, and progress at times seemed glacial, if not in reverse, but we did get there in the end. And along the way, Blair was able to do something important, I think, which Major would have liked to do, but could not do politically, which was to meet the Sinn Féin leadership in person. That was a huge media story, as those of you who were around at the time will remember when it first happened, but something, and there's a lesson there somewhere, which quickly became accepted as normal routine. Now, this highly abbreviated description of the lead-up to the Good Friday Agreement makes its achievement sound almost simple and inevitable. And perhaps it does feel that way to some people who weren't involved as they look back at it from now, 25 years later. But I want to be clear that it was neither of those things. It was not simple and it was not inevitable. And it was in many ways, I think, a miracle that we got there. That process could easily have been derailed at almost any moment, and nearly was several times in those final months, weeks, and even days. It was also, of course, very much the final outcome of decades of patient and difficult work to narrow gaps, reduce suspicions, draft endless texts, and identify possible ways forward. And these had continued under successive Prime Ministers, with landmarks along the way, such as the Anglo-Irish Agreement, astonishingly concluded by Mrs Thatcher, the Downing Street Declaration, and the Frameworks document. John Major did make a massive contribution to this towards the end through his own determination to keep trying and his work with successive Taoiseachs in Dublin. And I think final success was only possible at all because the stars had aligned in a rare way. Key parts of the Republican political leadership had concluded that they needed a political deal to prevent their children having to fight the same battles as they'd spent their life on. The British government concluded that there was no lasting security solution available. The Irish government had wanted a deal and was even prepared to amend its constitution to achieve it. The two main political parties at the time, the Ulster Unionists and the SDLP, were in different ways and to different degrees ready to find a power-sharing agreement. The leaders in Dublin, London and Washington got on well, and they wanted to make something happen. The talks process had struck lucky in finding in George Mitchell the perfect chair. The population was fed up with violence and wanted a more normal life. These were vital but potentially transitory conditions. And it's worth thinking about why Tony Blair was in the end able to build so successfully on all the work that John Major had done. It was not that their underlying views or attitudes or approaches differed in any substantial way. So I would single out several factors. First of all, the political strength and authority of a large majority, and the expectation, even at that early stage, that Blair would serve at least 2 terms. So waiting for his successor would have meant waiting at least 10 years. So this was a powerful incentive for the Northern Ireland parties, and indeed the Irish government, to do a deal with him, if at all possible. Secondly, the absence within his own Labour Party of any significant opposition to his policies on Northern Ireland, and the weakened position politically of Conservative politicians who were traditionally uneasy about where the talks were likely to go. Thirdly, his willingness, like that of John Major before him, to invest huge amounts of time, energy and political capital into the search for peace in Northern Ireland, even knowing that the domestic political dividends in the rest of Great Britain for doing so were small to non-existent. Fourthly, his ability to talk to all sides and to persuade them that he had their best interests at heart, even if this meant saying different things to different people at different times and sailing rather close to the wind at times. And finally, his close relationship with Bertie Ahern and the statesmanship shown by Bertie Ahern throughout the process, and I'm not saying that just because he's here, and Tony Blair's ability also to channel the close interest of Bill Clinton in useful directions at critical moments. Despite all these positive forces at work, I repeat that the Good Friday Agreement was no foregone conclusion. Lack of trust in the run-up was endemic. The irreconcilable differences over decommissioning of paramilitary weapons and the possibility of renewed violence hung over everything. And from a British point of view, this always seemed to me the most toxic and difficult issue. How do you deal with political violence in a democracy? Is it right to seem to reward violence? Isn't it reasonable to demand a definitive end to violence and the renunciation moment, thanks to some hastily cobbled together reassurances from us, encouragement from Bill Clinton, and statesmanship from David Trimble and others. And they continued to worry that somehow they'd lost out in this process, even though they'd won their most important demand of acceptance by all concerned of the principle of consent. Control of the narrative in what was almost always, and perhaps remains, seen as a zero-sum game was vital, and a lack of it almost scuppered the subsequent referendum in the North. So, agreement at the time seemed like a miracle, and to me, looking back, it still does. Now, obviously, as many people here know only too well, and as Bertie has talked about, the Good Friday Agreement was not the end of the arguments, but simply the beginning of a whole series of old ones and some new ones. My own role finished in spring '99, but years of crisis summits and knife-edge talks followed to try to get past lack of progress on decommissioning, North-South cooperation, how the institutions should operate, and to try and get those institutions to function as they were intended to. Implementation was nothing like what we had imagined at the time, and of course we are in many ways still going round that track, but that's another story. So how can we sum up what the Good Friday Agreement signified? His biggest success was obviously in bringing a lasting period of peace to Northern Ireland, and there has been a transformation in the lives of most of its people in terms of their ability to get on with their lives without fear. That alone, I think, is success enough for most political agreements of this kind. There is, of course, a lot more. Decommissioning did eventually happen, though it took far longer than anyone could possibly have anticipated. And the arguments about how much it really mattered continue. The Royal Ulster Constabulary was transformed, as we've heard, into the Northern Ireland Police Service. Discrimination on religious ground has reduced, if not disappeared. The Stormont institutions have worked well at times. Who would ever have imagined in 1997, certainly not me, seeing Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness governing together? At the same time, a lot of what we hoped and imagined at the time of the Good Friday Agreement has not happened. Much of the unionist and nationalist communities still largely exist in parallel and mutually hostile universes. The two mainstream parties which had gone the extra mile to conclude the deal, the SDLP and the Ulster Unionists, were rejected by the electorate in favour of the DUP and Sinn Féin. Education remains largely segregated. Politics remains largely tribal, and trust between leaders is low, to put it no stronger. We had hoped at the time that the politicians of Northern Ireland could stop aiming so many of their speeches at the UK and international audiences and get down to fixing the hospitals and the schools. But the constitutional issues still loom largest over everything. Perhaps these hopes and expectations were naive, given the history. In any case, progress towards a more integrated and harmonious society has, without doubt, been painfully slow. Attitudes in the younger generation give grounds for renewed hope for the future, and I hope that's what comes to pass. But too many still seem to cling on to the same old tropes heard from their parents. An interesting counterfactual is to ask what would have happened if we had not succeeded in reaching agreement on Good Friday 25 years ago. The short and obvious answer is that we would have gone back to working away at it in the hope of doing better next time. The May 1998 deadline was always artificial, even though in the end it did concentrate minds as had been hoped. I don't think we'd have gone back to the drawing board. The Good Friday Agreement was already in many ways, as Seamus Mallon famously put it, Sunningdale for slow learners. The wheel didn't need to be reinvented, and perhaps that would have worked in time. That underlying desire for peace would have pushed all sides into another try. But there would have been nothing inevitable about this and about success. Unionists, loyalists and Republicans might have concluded in their own ways that the other side was irredeemably hopeless and incapable of making the necessary compromises. The souring of relations amid the unavoidable recriminations and blame games after such a failure could have complicated a renewed peace process for years. If violence had restarted, it would not easily have been stopped again, at least not quickly. The alignment of stars, as I've talked about, and the coincidence of compatible personalities might well not have recurred any time quickly. The readiness of some of the principals to put other things on hold and to continue to give vast amounts of time and effort to the elusive search for peace in Northern Ireland could certainly not have been guaranteed. Look at what's happened in the Middle East and efforts to solve the Palestinian dispute. Peace based on a two-state solution was very close 25 years ago, but the deal could not be closed because some of the principals found it easier to say no and preferred not to confront their own supporters, likely to be disappointed, maybe furious, with the compromises they'd made. Now, 25 years later, any kind of lasting settlement for the Palestinian problems looks as far away as it ever has. And worse, no one is even really trying. So for the Good Friday Agreement to be reached, the day had to be seized, and it was just. One lesson for Northern Ireland, I think, hardly an original one, but an appropriate one for this gathering, is that its peace and prosperity are best assured when the British and Irish governments work together harmoniously, even if their interests and views are never likely to be exactly the same. And that's particularly the case when the government in Washington is also pushing in the same direction without interfering too much. The parties in the end have to be the ones who make peace and move forward, but they often need help to do so. Brexit has made such cooperation more complex and more difficult in Northern Ireland in many ways, but it's also made it more necessary, not less. And I echo very strongly what Bertie Ahern was saying about this in his own remarks. The point is that without the cooperative relationship between London and Dublin, each capital trying to bring along and reassure the parties closest to them, with all the complexities and problems that brought for both of us, the Good Friday Agreement could never have happened. There were still lots of rows and misunderstandings, even during the good periods. Each side often thought the other was exaggerating the difficulties they were having with those they were working with. But that habit of working together and the underlying trust built up over the years, enhanced by the Blair-Ahern relationship I've talked about, just got us through. I suspect this could only have been managed between two mature democracies and bureaucracies. In the end, both sides, despite the difficulties, were able to keep their eyes on the bigger picture and the wider goal, and overcome their often conflicting instincts and emotions. Are there wider lessons for the world from what happened in Belfast 25 years ago? There have been many attempts to transfer the learnings to other contexts. I've been involved in some, for example, in Burma, Myanmar. Most have not really borne fruit, if the truth is to be told. Certainly the particular circumstances of Northern Ireland are not replicated elsewhere. Nevertheless, I believe there is a vital need to use again the example of Northern Ireland in today's world. The international community, whatever those words now mean, seems to have lost the knack of solving difficult problems and producing peace, and has lost even the will to tackle them. Nationalism is the order of the day, and the great powers are too busy competing with each other to cooperate, even when it's manifestly in their own interests. Conflicts are left to fester, and fester they certainly do. Protagonists who are never going to be able to solve their problems without a significant degree of outside help and pressure are not getting either. The result is discouraging for the world and appalling for the civilian populations, who are always and inevitably the ones who suffer most. The lesson is not that peacemaking is easy or usually rewarded. It most definitely is not. But success is possible and always worth investing in. Yes, the stars, or enough of them, need to align. There has to be some readiness on the part of the struggling parties to accept that continuing violence and intransigence will not get them what they want. There have to be actors who are ready to invest large amounts of time and effort to bridge gaps, to find compromises, not to take no for an answer, and who are ready to risk their own reputations. And if the right day does arrive, the moment has to be seized when the opportunity is there. It might not recur. And we also have to accept that any deal is not likely to resolve all the problems, as it has not in Northern Ireland, and as it has not, for example, in the Balkans, following the hard-won Dayton Peace Agreement of the 1990s. But such problems can be tackled with much more hope of success if there is at least peace as a basic background. And if no one is even trying to make peace, the prospects are bleak indeed. We got lucky in Northern Ireland. Our successors needed and need to stay lucky, especially in the contentious context of Brexit. We knew when we did the Good Friday deal that there would always be likely to be some people not ready to accept the compromises and ready to go back to violence. We have indeed seen that, albeit in a very minor way, and we continue to do so, as events of recent weeks have proved. But the key to success in beating such people is that they need to be an obviously out of touch and out of line small minority, not a group able to swim in a sea of wider popular support. I think that is the lasting achievement and significance of the Good Friday Agreement. But even that cannot be taken for granted. The struggle against extremism and for reconciliation has to be constant. And the readiness to keep trying, even when the prospects for success look bleak, must be there. That is also the significance of the Good Friday Agreement as we mark its 25 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sir John, for an absolutely excellent speech and thoughts for all of us to consider. You talked about being lucky and the stars aligned, but it was quite clear that luck was actually the hard work that went into all of this from everybody who was so determined. And if it hadn't been for all that hard work, those stars could never have aligned. I'm also struck by the point about that really actually from Bertie as well, this is a process, not an event, that actually that agreement, that monumental agreement 25 years ago, which did transform lives, but there's so much more that needs to be achieved, and that's something that we as an Assembly need to think very hard about what we can do to help that process continue. And I suppose my final reflection on everything you've said is that you said it's easier to say no. And that's true, but leadership is doing difficult things even if they're not necessarily popular. And that leadership is what we saw in 1998. We saw it across the board from everybody. The stars may have aligned that everyone was prepared to show that leadership, but that hard work and the work that you and Bertie and all that team did is something we should all reflect on. So thank you so much for giving your time. We have about 10 minutes for questions, and Lord Bew caught my eye some time ago, so I'm going to start with you, Paul.
Stand, is that not right? First of all, I'd like to echo the thanks both to Sir John Holmes and to Bertie's excellent presentations. And I have a difficulty, I don't really disagree with a word. There is one thing that I would like to tease out a bit more and to ask, does the drama which John particularly dwelt on, and I'm now looking at John Taylor, Lord Kilclooney, the drama of the 40-foot barge pole, which many people at the beginning of the week said, that's it, it's over. It's not, you know, this is not going to happen, this agreement. Does that drama, and I know that John's views on that, the subject of North-South for many years before that were actually very subtle and well informed. So I knew you know, some of the complexity of the thinking behind that moment. But is it the drama in itself which actually has a role in making the thing move forward? In other words, is there something about that moment, something about the decision by the then Taoiseach to modify the Irish negotiating position, which somehow in human terms connects the then Taoiseach with the soon-to-be First Minister of Northern Ireland, and at some level, not something you'd ever planned for, not something that John Holmes in Number 10 said, let's have a drama, let's have a document that goes a bit too far and we all talk ourselves back from that. Just as a matter of accidental political drama, in some way make the whole project of the Good Friday Agreement at the end of that week much firmer and much stronger. And of course the key thing there is the decision by the then Taoiseach to be flexible and to think what is really true, which is what are Ireland's real interests then. Because Ireland's real interests were instability on the island of Ireland, above all, and in a settlement that Northern nationalists could live with. And it's clear that he got it right. So I was kind of moved to just reflect on just the significance of a totally unexpected political drama, especially in the presence of some of the main agents, Lord Kilclooney and the Taoiseach, a totally unexpected political, in actually not only not knocking it off the road, the project of the agreement, but actually making the agreement in human terms more, and that's what does ultimately matter, more real and stronger.
Thank you, Lord Bew. Can I ask Sir John and Bertie, could you perhaps come and sit at the front here? If you don't mind, I've got a few people who've caught my eye, and I'm very conscious that we do have to finish at 11. So can I bring in Colin McGrath and then Lord Kilclooney, and then we'll let you respond to those 3 points.
Buildings in Stormont in Belfast, and I would like to acknowledge being in this room. I've been an MLA for nearly 7 years, and only for 3 of those years has this room actually sat as an assembly, so it is a bit of a novel place to be today. And I want to begin by thanking Bertie and John and others that are here today that played their part in the Good Friday Agreement as it reached its culmination, I was concluding my university degree, and that was a degree that included a placement that had to be rearranged for a few miles from here because one terrorist organisation decided that it simply wanted to shoot Catholics, and therefore I had to be removed out of that estate and conclude my placement somewhere else. So the work of the Good Friday Agreement obviously brought a lot more stability here that enabled me to progress and others of my generation. But the 2 points that I would like to ask questions about, first, obviously from the Good Friday Agreement, it's recognition that we need to make some changes to it. I believe some of the changes that were made in the St Andrews Agreement have created many of the difficulties that we are currently facing, and I think some of that damage needs to be undone and we need to see more changes. But I wonder just if you have a view about some of the changes that you would like to see. And given, and I'm afraid we're going to have to keep a record of this, given that we don't actually have any representatives of the DUP here, do you have any advice for them as they approach the decisions that they have to take in the next few weeks? Thank you.
Forgive me for not standing up. First of all, it's great to be sitting in the same seat that I used to sit on when I was Cabinet Minister for Home Affairs in Northern Ireland. And this is the first time I've been back in this building for 51 years. I was in the Ulster Hospital just up the road, and Brian Faulkner demanded I should come here to address 10,000 people outside Stormont. And the hospital said I was allowed out for 4 hours because I'd just been the subject of an assassination attempt by the IRA. Anyway, I want to pay tribute to Bertie Ahern, to Tony Blair, to Paul Murphy. They're the ones who really did the hard work that brought about the Belfast Agreement. And I don't think that is accurately recorded by young journalists in their 20s today who weren't even born 25 years ago and don't know who was important and who wasn't important. But they certainly were, and I appreciate it, especially Tony Blair, in the midst of the Iraqi war, gave more time to Northern Ireland. I was amused when Sir John mentioned the Middle East, because I remember bringing the Belfast Agreement to Ramallah to give a copy to Arafat and said, here's the basis on which you should get an agreement between Palestine and Israel. It hasn't happened. And as one who opposes a united Ireland, I do remember the very first day the meeting took place of the Belfast Agreement talks, under chairmanship George Mitchell, and at Stormont, not in this building. And he said, I want us to agree an agenda. And for some reason, David Trimble was unable to attend. And as his deputy, he said, John, I want you to lead the unionist delegation at the talks. And I jumped up to Senator Mitchell, who was a Maronite, and my solicitor was a Maronite, which gave us a close relationship. And I said to him, you can hardly cooperate with another country south of your border. I live near the border, I came there this morning, if they don't even recognise you. How can you talk to people who say you don't exist? And so I said, the first thing on the agenda must be the recognition of Northern Ireland as part of the United Kingdom. The then Foreign Minister of the Republic of Ireland, David Andrews, jumped up and said, no way will that happen. No way should that be on the agenda. So he was not in favour of recognition at that time. And I stood up in front of Senator Mitchell and said, sorry, that's fundamental. I'm now taking the Ulster Union's delegation out of the talks. And that was very serious on the very first day of the talks, which ended up with the Belfast Agreement. And Mitchell said, right, but stay in the building. So we stayed in the building all day from 10 o'clock in the morning until 5 o'clock in the afternoon when Mitchell called us back. And he said, Dublin has now reconsidered their position and that can be on the agenda. And that was the beginning of movement which led to the Belfast Agreement. Now, as one who opposes United Ireland, I say to our Irish friends who are here today, who have a great belief and want a United Ireland, have you ever thought of what it means to you? I want Bertie in particular to answer this one. It would mean the arrival of 1 million Brits in the so-called new Republic of Ireland. 1 million Brits. And they would hold 15 seats in Ahern. And there would have to be a coalition of Brits from Northern Ireland in the government of the Republic. And those Brits would therefore be ruling Kerry and Cork and places like that. Have the Irish really thought this out? Because I think there's a great call for a United Ireland, but the Irish never think it out of what it means to them. That's my question to Bertie.
Would you like some more questions to be put before you respond?
Well, thanks very much. First of all, the question on the North-South bodies, Lord Bew raised. There has been a long discussion during the talks about the areas that would be suitable for North-South cooperation, and there was a list drawn up in the Department of the Taoiseach of what those areas would be. As I think a few people in this room remember, that list was agreed with the British government. So we had concluded the discussion with the British government that they had agreed on that. But then the case was made that, listen, if we could get North-South bodies set up and get the structure of North-South bodies set up and get it and define the number of areas, incrementally over time. And this is what happened. There were many areas like cancers and maternity services and other issues that afterwards there was great cooperation on, that you didn't actually need to have implementation bodies. And of course, when Norton Cooney mentioned that that he wouldn't touch the whole process with a 40-foot pole, I decided that we need to engage in more comprehensive discussion and come to an agreement, which we did. And David Trimble, the late David Trimble, and I agreed that list. But it was a dividing point. There was no doubt about it. We weren't going to make much more progress. And at that time, we were trying to get, and people will forget now. I'll try and be short about this, but people forget now that we hadn't even agreed then that there was going to be an assembly. It wasn't a unanimous view that we should have an assembly in the discussions. There wasn't a unanimous view we should have an executive. It was only, Lord Murphy would remember, it was only late, I think, on the Thursday night when we finally got the agreement between the Ulster Unionist Party and the SDLP that we would have that. So then I decided to move and to change the demand and to refine the implementation bodies into certain areas which worked well. I had offered, just for the historical record in this way, I had offered that we should amalgamate the IDA and Invest Northern Ireland as one of the issues. That may not have been loved by everybody at the time, but and there was maybe some opposition from IDA in Dublin as well to it, though I do think it would have made a lot of sense, and I did to this day, it would have made a lot of sense. When you go on trade missions, and people will find this after Brexit, when this assembly is back up and running again, and Speaker Maskey made a point this morning, they're going to have to go out to build up investment and trade. Nobody ever really asked, which part of Ireland you were. When you went around Silicon Valley and you were trying to get investment, it was the island of Ireland, so it made eminent sense to have all-island trade. But anyway, that wasn't agreed at the time. On the issue of changes, your point on the changes, my strong advice is that the institution should be up and running. Not to fall into the trap of having a debate about the reform before the institutions are up and running. And the reason is there will not be any changes unless there is the 3 C's, cross-community consent. And you won't get cross-community consent on most of these issues. So in the cold light or cool light of day or the good light of day, I think you can have a sensible discussion about reform, as we did in St Andrews in October 2006. But to try and have that will delay the Assembly. It will be used for a delaying tactic for the Assembly. So let the institutions be set up as quickly as possible on the end of this current debate on the Windsor Agreement. And then, if there are areas for reform, let those issues. But do not do it the other way around. It'll be a fatal mistake, believe me. It's not that I'm saying I think cross-community consent should be used for everything. It's not that I'm saying that because I can see arguments where it's not. But if you try and get that agreement first, it will delay the institutions up. On the question of, I moved when I was young. I wanted a united Ireland, John. Now I want a new Ireland, and I want a new Ireland where, reasonable, moderate people like you will be able to play a key. Will be able to play a key role in the new Ireland, and that the 15 moderate unionists that will be elected to Dáil Éireann will help to make that even a better place than it is today.
Shall I add a few words? I'm certainly not going to go near the third question, because it wasn't addressed to me, luckily. On the first point, I think Lord Bew is right, that it was a seminal moment, because I do recall, and I think I mentioned this briefly in what I just said, that first of all, agreeing to renegotiate those bodies, and secondly, returning to Belfast from Dublin literally just after the funeral of your mother made a profound impression, as my recollection, on the unionists, because it showed real readiness to engage and to compromise and to work for an agreement. And that, I think, did infuse the rest of those talks for the next few days. So I think it was a seminal moment, even though it started very inauspiciously. Just again for the historical record, I had been part of negotiating the framework for the North-South cooperation bodies, not the list. And I was horrified when I saw the list which was published, which I'd been assured by the Northern Ireland office at the time was non-controversial. Well, that was not true. But they were brought back to a reasonable level, although, of course, that was hardly the end of the argument, because many years were spent on trying to get it right after that. On changes to the Good Friday Agreement, I don't really claim any expertise. I have not been involved in any way in the process since 1999. I think what I would say is that the Good Friday Agreement should not be regarded as a gospel, where you can't change any word, whatever its status. I wouldn't be opposed in principle to changing bits of it, and bits of it were effectively changed by subsequent agreements. I think the more important thing is what is happening, or what is being said, or what is being done in the spirit of that agreement. And the spirit of that agreement was that everybody gave something, everybody got something, nobody got everything they wanted. And that was what made it possible, and that's why it was miraculous in some ways. So you'd need to have that spirit now, as you had then, if you're going to move forward. And that's more important than the details of whether, well, that's what it says in the Good Friday Agreement or in the St Andrews Agreement, so we can't go back on that. To me, that's a bit like governing from the dictates of the Bible, which was written in a completely different context and not taking into account modern events. But the spirit is I would say, the most important thing, and that needs to be there too.
Thank you. As you can see, we've not stopped at 11 o'clock, as is always the way in a British Irish Parliamentary Assembly. There's much interest. I'm going to take 4 final questions. If you can keep them short, that would be appreciated. And then we will let our speakers go back on to their whatever important stuff they've got for the rest of the day. But I've got Kate Nicholl, Neil O'Donoghue, Reg MP and John Lahart.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you so much. So John mentioned Bertie Ahern going to his mother's funeral during the negotiations, and I think this is a moment that has been lost a lot in recounting of it and the personal sacrifices that so many people made, but especially you, and I want to pay tribute to you and thank you for all the work that you both did. My name is Kate Nicholl. I'm an Alliance MLA and I was elected in May. So this is my first time having a debate in this chamber that is not to elect a speaker. I note your comments around reform and I respectfully disagree. The fact that we have been in here 6 times to nominate a speaker and we have not had one because it required cross-community consent, and my party, the cross-community party's votes do not count within that, to me is very clear that we do need to reform this. If the DUP do not come back into the Assembly, would you not agree that reforming the institutions to willing majority, willing coalition, is the way forward to get the Assembly up and running? Because political uncertainty will continue to escalate without stable government. Thank you.
Thank you, co-chairs, and thanks to our guests today. I had intended to ask a question about the All-Ireland bodies, and I didn't realise it would sort of gather this sort of interest in advance, but I would hope that with the wisdom of years, and hopefully it's not too much to ask, that the Lord Kilclooney would appreciate now that the All-Ireland bodies actually are positive and dealing with the fallout of issues like the dreaded B word, Brexit. When you look at the impact of the pandemic across the island, that there's no finer example in Ireland than our rugby team of showing that when Ireland works best, it works as one. So what we actually need, Bertie, I think, is in the context of looking at the re-establishment of the Good Friday Agreement apparatus and institutions, a firm view on the significance and the importance of the existing All-Ireland bodies, but also as the world changes around us, because I agree with you absolutely that this forum provides us with a really important East-West opportunity for engagement, but by virtue of its make-up it also allows for a really important strand too, North-South engagement between the Assembly and the Oireachtas. So from your perspective, because I think it's important that this Assembly doesn't send a message that somehow our existing All-Ireland bodies are contentious or controversial. They're not. We need more of them. That's the lesson of the last 25 years. So where would you envisage that we could grow that cooperation on an all-Ireland basis as hopefully the institutions are re-established? And how important do you think it is for the Irish Government to act as a driver? Because it's important to remember that the all-Ireland bodies work both ways and they benefit everyone from Kerry to Derry. Thank you.
Chair, I would just want to make a point about the All-Ireland bodies. It wasn't, the crisis arose not because of the areas of influence that they would have had. It was because the proposal that was made in the initial draft was to give them all-Ireland executive powers, which meant that they would operate freely without the consent or accountability to this Assembly and to the Dáil. So it wasn't so much the areas of cooperation, it was the fact that they would have had executive powers. And that was the point of John's barge pole, for which he's been maligned because he was right and there was no argument amongst our delegation. It was just a showstopper. And I have to say, had Bertie not come back from waking his mother to fix that, there'd have been no deal, I can assure you. It was as simple as that. So the other point I would make is reform. There are mechanisms in the agreement for review. I mean, when we negotiated, we weren't stupid. Nothing lasts forever, and you have to do that. But I would gently point out to Kate that her party negotiated it and went to the people and recommended it in a referendum, as we all did. So we can't do bits and pieces to suit a particular point at a particular time, and I think Bertie's advice is right. There's a way of doing it. It's an all-party agreement. It's not an agreement between two governments. And therefore, the parties have to sit down and deal with it in the processes that are provided for in the agreement. And I would also make the final point. We are celebrating or commemorating an agreement 25 years ago, but the agreement we have operating today is not the agreement we negotiated. It is not the agreement that went to a referendum. It has been amended. And Colin McGrath made reference to that. The mechanism for electing First Minister is why we're in trouble. Because what the governments did, and this is the one thing I disagree with Bertie and Tony Blair, they rewarded the people who didn't negotiate Strand 1. Because neither the DUP or Sinn Féin participated in those negotiations. And subsequently, they changed the rules, ironically, so that instead of having cross-community consent in a joint resolution for First and Deputy First Minister in this chamber, it became just the largest party, irrespective of designation. And whatever you may feel about the designation, the point of that negotiation was to show that it was a genuine partnership and no section of the community could operate without the consent of the other. So we had a joint veto. Awkward, but necessary to bring people together to sit in this building when many nationalists wouldn't have put a foot in it for many, many years. Now, that was taken away to fix a particular political problem. And I think that is why we've had all these years of difficulty, because what we were envisaging when we negotiated that is we could bring in to get people focused more on economically driven politics rather than on the constitutional. Every subsequent election was Ian Paisley would say, if you don't vote for me, you get Martin McGuinness. I've held the office. There is no difference. You couldn't send a letter out of the department without both people agreeing to it. The mistake we made was the names and what we called it. We were looking at what was happening in Scotland at that time, where they were having a First Minister, but that was probably an error. So I'd like to ask our panellists whether they consider that an issue, and I would just wanted to make it clear that cross-border bodies, I was instrumental in establishing two of them, Intertrade Ireland, Tourism Ireland. They're fine, there's nothing wrong with them. They can perhaps be adapted to try and fix the mess we're currently in, and use the agreement to fix things instead of trying to imagine new ones. But I would simply be interested in the response of our guests. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. And thanks to Sir John and Bertie. Particularly want to acknowledge Bertie's presence today as my former party leader and former Taoiseach in what's a particularly difficult day for him that you mightn't be aware of. He's an avid Manchester United fan. So it took a lot of courage to come and speak to us, and we appreciate it. Please say nothing, Chair. Let that one pass. Just to reassure or to respond to Lord Kilclooney, and it's a privilege to be with him today. I suppose as an Irish Republican from the Fianna Fáil tradition, I would say to you, coming from a country that was colonised and ruled for 800 years by what we would have regarded as a foreign power, the idea of sharing power with fellow countrymen and women is a much more attractive proposition than what was endured heretofore. And to follow on to what Bertie said in relation to a new Ireland, I think this body should be aware that there is a much more mature debate and discussion going on this island in relation to its future. There was a time, and I'm a little younger than Bertie, but not too much younger. I grew up certainly when the notion of a united Ireland would have taken the form of a recolonisation, where it was all about a kind of a nationalist reversal of what had historically taken place. There's a much more mature conversation taking place in relation to that. So it's in that context I'd address this question to both Sir John and Bertie. And it's the border poll concept, where it seems to me that much more work needs to be done, whether it's in the Assembly being up and running for a substantial period of time, so that people have confidence in the fact that the institutions that were provided for under the Good Friday Agreement actually work, and should work for a period of time and be seen to work for a period of time before we would approach that, because otherwise it seems to me that it's just trying to attempt a win, a numerical win, which isn't guaranteed, of course, because there's so many topics. It seems like a black and white subject. It is not a black and white subject, so many things to be considered. But just your considered views, both of you, in relation to the border poll issue and where you think we should go on that as an island. Thanks, Chair.
Maybe I think Kate made an issue about the reform, and I think Niall made it as well, and Reg has made it. So I just take those together. I mean, it is true that it was the executive powers and the fact that it wouldn't be answerable in any way to Stormont and to the new executive, that was the concern. The length of the bodies as well. My own view is that we should be trying to cooperate in as many areas as possible. But once the threat that it's not all some hidden agenda, it makes absolute sense to be cooperating. We've experts in of all kind of areas across the island, and the more that I'm involved in a charity epilepsy foundation, and some of the most eminent people on these islands are here in the north, some in the south, and the whole island there's no centre. So, you know, the fact that people work and cooperate on an all-island basis makes sense, and I think we should have far more bodies. But and I think that's happening almost unofficially. At least it was happening. There were more and more people cooperating and working. An awful lot of the business groups. The farmers are brilliant at this. The farmers are probably leave everyone behind because they're really good at operating and coordinating through all kinds of sectors. So I think that should happen. The review mechanism, of course, is in the agreement, and Reg is also right. We were trying to resolve something that we hadn't been successful in doing in 1998. We were trying to bring all parties in, and we were trying to bring the DUP into the process, and the review was about that. My memory of it is that there was an awful lot of objection to some of the things that we did afterwards, and there wasn't as much at the time we were doing it. Maybe it was highlighted better afterwards, but I do accept that it made some of the issues more difficult. I do accept that. And the review, the reason, Kate, I just want to be very clear in this. I understand totally the Alliance argument. I understand absolutely the argument they're making. What I don't want to see, and I feel there could be a trap in this, that I know for a fact that if you try to get around the cross-community consent issue and to get parties to agree to set that aside so that you can make the changes, it's not going to happen. It just won't happen. So what I'm saying is get the institutions up and running and functioning, and then you can debate these issues. If you do it the other way around, the institutions won't get up and running, and believe me, that's what will happen, because I know what the other parties are saying. So I think it is a way you can argue out the strength of your case afterwards. John Lahart, I think, makes the point about the work. I think there is a case. The institutions, you know my position, I've said it 1,000 times on the border poll. If you look what happened in Canada some years ago, they're probably the biggest referendum issues in recent decades. Canada, Scotland and Brexit. The one thing you don't do is have a vote until the work is done. If you have a vote and you put to the people, we're having a vote on whatever it is, and then somebody says, well, explain to us now how that's going to work in practice. How is the PSNI and the Garda Síochána going to integrate? How will that be running? Who will be the commissioner and who will be the head? How will QCs and SCs operate in the legal system of the courts? How is the integration of the civil service going to be? Well, I'll tell you what the result of the vote will be if you can't answer the questions. And I never mentioned finance. When in doubt, I was taught when I was playing under-10 football with Home Farm, I was a left full, and when the ball went over my head, my coach always said, well in doubt, put it out. And that's exactly what people do in politics too. When in doubt, to put it out. So if you can't answer the questions, so therefore, two things have to happen. The stability of the institutions has to be up and running for a prolonged period, whatever that is. I don't know what that prolonged period is. And the work has to be done. Now, the work has only started, and I think there is an argument that there should be far more work going on. I think there should be. Now I know a number of universities and academic institutes and some private funders are putting in considerable money. So the work is now being done. And it will be done. I mean, I think that it will come to a conclusion. I've been asked before, when will all that? Well, I don't know when it will come to a conclusion, but I think it has to be said this, that, and people forget this now, but it was an absolute integral part of the Good Friday Agreement that there would be polls from time to time. And the only reason we haven't had that to date is because of the instability of the institutions. But we would not have had an agreement for lots of reasons, but we wouldn't have had one unless there was a path that there would on another day be votes where people would be able to see moving to we said a united Ireland 25 years ago because that's what's in the agreement. But so that issue is there. We have to remember that, and there are some people now saying, well, you can never have a vote, you never should have a vote. Well, that's not the agreement, so you have to leave that one aside. So I think the issue is, John, the institutions being up and running, stable, and the work, the necessary work, so that it can be a case put, a white paper, or put to the people so that people understand what the questions are. And until that's done, you'd be wasting taxpayers' money having a vote, because the answer will be against. Now, it might always be against, but you'd certainly be against if you can't answer the questions. So I think that's my view. I think that the one thing Reg has dealt with this, but the review mechanism in the agreement is there for looking at a broad range of issues. As John has said, the idea that you agree with this agreement, nothing can be changed. I mean, that's a nonsense. But I suppose if you go back to the 2006 one, Reg, you could argue that maybe if all the parties should, along with the two governments, should have been across the agreement, maybe it would have been better. But we were trying to fix a particular aspect at the time. We were trying to bring in the Democratic Unionist Party into the process, because we thought that was better for the long-term stability of the agreement.
I'll be very brief. I'm not going to venture into this question of cross-party consent and so on. I'm not qualified to do so. Just one point on the North-South bodies. We were always from a British government point of view, a bit bemused sometimes by this argument about how many there should be and what the real problem was, but it was clearly very emotionally felt on both sides. And of course the issue was that it was seen by one side as this is the slippery slope to unification. I mean, obviously that's why people were worried about them. So that's why it had to be clear that these were not ideologically bodies being set up for ideological reasons. They were there for practical reasons, practical cooperation, which would benefit to both sides. And if that's the approach you take, then I think you can succeed. If they get to be seen as, the forerunners of unification or a slippery slope, then opposition will continue. On the border poll, I mean, my advice for what it's worth, which I don't think is much, is that everybody should be extremely careful about this. You might not get more than one successful go at this. And I say that for two. I mean, and you need to look at Scotland and maybe at Quebec, as Bertie was saying, to learn lessons about this. If you rush into it because you think you've got the numerical majority, if it's a 50% plus one kind of vote, he's always going to be seen as something being done to one group by another. And you may or may not win it, but it's not going to be a very successful process. And if you go into it in the spirit that if we don't win this time, we'll win next time, that's not the right way to go about it somehow, I feel. It's that we only have to win once, and you have to win every time. And that creates the wrong kind of dynamics about it. If it's going to be successful for unification, both in its result and in its application and implementation, it's got to be something which represents something which you've evolved towards and which comes to seem more natural than it certainly seems at the moment. So I would counsel great care. And if if you rush into it and you lose, and this is what the SNP have essentially done, it's not so easy to go back to it. And I totally agree with what Bertie says. If you're going to do it, you have to do the work first. You have to be able to answer the questions first, which I think the SNP notably did not do. I'm probably offending somebody around the table here by saying that. But anyway, that's kind of my view for what it's worth.
Thank you so much. And I'm sorry we couldn't bring more people in to ask questions. Margaret and Emma, I promise you are first on the list for the next set of questions if you wish to ask a question at that point. We obviously have the debate later, and I'm sure that the contributions that we've received today and what we've heard from Bertie and Sir John will form part of our discussions when we have our 90-minute debate at the end of the day. We are significantly over time, but I think we all agree that it was wonderful to have such eminent speakers, and therefore we should make the most of your time. I'm going to close the session now and tell everyone you have no more than 10 minutes, and we will start the next session at 22, absolutely firmly on time, because Karen Smith is going to be facilitating it and she won't allow it to start late. So if you're late, you'll miss it. Thank you very much again to Bertie Ahern and Sir John Holmes. And please be back here for 22. Thank you.